Is spirituality simply an esoteric remnant of a bygone era, or is it an imminent flourish within everyday experience? How do we understand the pluralism of forces that compose our consciousness and our continuity with otherworldly beings? What revolutionary force must we harness in order to accelerate the utopian impulses within both spiritual as well as secular struggle? How may we achieve a red enlightenment? Welcome back to Zero Repeater. Adam from Massive Horizon here, and today we are joined by Graham Jones, author of the aforementioned Red Enlightenment on Socialism, Science and Spirituality, out now on Repeater Books. Graham has also, of course, written other books, for example, The Shock Doctrine of the Left, and of course he has an extensive Red Enlightenment podcast, which you can find on Repeater Radio and its all associated feeds. Graham, welcome, or welcome back to Acid Horizon.
Hi, thanks very much for having me on.
All right, so let's kick things off with the question of, because it's a very wide and encompassing book. You know, it's a systematic presentation of a pluralist, materialist, and dynamic outlook on ways of understanding the world in terms of our social relations and our current predicament. But it's also very much tied up with questions of ethics and questions of dialogue with a whole host of sources from across the globe. But before we just get to the real meat of it, I just wanted to ask, what's the impulse behind this book? You know, where did it sort of arrive from? What sort of discourses were you looking to intervene in, where you felt the discussion on around philosophy and particularly in spirituality and religion, particularly on the left, has been so lacking?
So I guess where it's come from is sort of a bringing together lots of different threads. So there's a couple of sort of biographical ones, just having had in my sort of past, in my upbringing, sort of religion and spirituality kind of in the air, and losing that in my younger years, going into a more sort of hyper rational, scientific kind of ways of thinking, and realizing at a certain point that I was missing something that I wanted to try and sort of reconnect with, without sort of necessarily sort of undoing everything that had come up to that point. So sort of wanting to integrate a sort of a scientific worldview and my generally leftist politics. For quite a long time, I had this sort of desire to bring something akin to spirituality into them. And this book was the start of, the product of trying to do that. At the same time, when I started to do this kind of thing, started to attempt kind of spiritual practice alongside leftist kind of ideas, the thing you very quickly come up against is the leftist resistance to religion and spirituality. And so this was kind of like a necessary sort of step to get over that, to get beyond that kind of barrier, without denying the critiques and the concerns that come along with that, but to try and actually answer them and to engage with them productively, not simply dismiss them one way or another. So I guess that's kind of broadly where the book has come from, is trying to integrate those things, but also just more of a general interest in global modes of thinking and historical modes of thinking that may have been lost or never even sort of engaged with on the West. And basically, one of the reasons why the book covers so much is it's trying to answer so many questions that I had for myself, and so many things that I really wanted to sort of integrate together. So I guess that's kind of where we start with it. But I think also one really important thing, and I think you kind of get the sense of this in the intro in the first chapter of the book, is I wanted to try and go beyond merely critique of sort of colonial modes of thought. Over the past sort of 10 or 15 years, there's been a general kind of popularization among the left, at least, of decolonial thinking. It's increasingly just seen as a unquestioned thing, that is just part of being a leftist now. Obviously, some people will disagree, but I think that's becoming kind of a hegemonic kind of way of thinking. But so often I feel like we get stuck at the level of critique and don't move on to then reconstructing beyond that critique. So there'll be criticism, for example, of drawing only from European modes of thought, from European thinkers and history. And there'll be this sort of, thinking about like how people write about this. Often there'll be, you might see a sentence like, we have to question how we move beyond this purely Eurocentric mode of thinking. But then no one actually takes the next step of trying to answer that question and actually trying to put forward some actual like concrete, bringing together of non-Western modes of thought. And so I guess that's also, I was trying to do that because I wasn't seeing enough people doing that. And maybe, if in presenting this, I might open myself up to criticism. But I think it's necessary to kind of move, if you will, the dialectic on, to present something that people think critique and take apart and draw some influence from and reject other parts and then move it onwards in that direction. Because I think we risk getting stuck in a cycle where we only ever criticize and don't recreate.
I couldn't agree more. I think you're even starting to do this by virtue of the front cover itself, because of course the front cover has an endorsement from Brian Van Norden, who writes this, this amazing multicultural manifesto for taking back philosophy from this Western-centric mode. And I think that's very. I mean, it's moves the dialectic onward between a dialectic really when we say the left here, I guess what we're really meaning is a certain kind of Western, very secular, intellectual, sort of the reading and writing public of a certain sect in which this, well, not certain sect, a certain segment or fraction of what we could call the left, which has these very secular concerns, drawing back from it's a very Marxist tradition. I mean, Marx gets his start out in the 1840s with the young Hegelians, and all they're talking about is critiquing religion, how to free ourselves from religion. This is where Marx comes from. And it is fundamentally based on this European epistemology. This is something that the great Cedric Robertson points out in a book like Black Marxism, where it's all this inheritance, all this epistemological baggage, where Europe is at the forefront of every kind of developments, and even in its worst, is still the most advanced by any standard of knowledge. And this is absolutely built into the very word enlightenment. We're going to go into the good question now that came from, for everyone from Kant to Foucault in the tradition of sort of Western, modern European philosophy. What is enlightenment? What is red enlightenment? Because, of course, when we say enlightenment within that certain fraction of the left, everyone is thinking, you get Voltaire, you get these deists or sort of anti-clerical struggles, you get the French Revolution, Rousseau, Newton, sort of Kepler, Kant, Hume, and of course, really, we're getting that sense. There's another sense of enlightenment, the spiritual enlightenment you would find in a religion like Buddhism, for example. They literally, rather than the Enlightenment as a German Aufklärung, a clearing away, rather enlightenment as literally being lightened from the burden of certain false presuppositions, which, if anything, goes to the heart of the entire philosophical project. So, just to sort of simplify, just to sort of round it out into a question, sort of how does the term enlightenment fit into the projects that you're trying to carry out here, and how can we think about this legacy of enlightenment as a kind of an essentially contested term between spiritual relief, spiritual transformation, and an anti-religious, anti-clerical, anti-Christian scientific revolution? Because, of course, as you mentioned in the book, there are two different ways you can treat it. And as you mentioned, when we talk about decolonial thoughts, like, we can just add it to the pile. As you said, we can do like a curatorial thing. Okay, now we're just including it. We're not really engaging with it. Or we can do what the Germans, particularly, the Schlegels and your Schellings and that and the Goethes in the 1900s did, which was become too fascinated and essentially, do what Edward Said would call Orientalism. So how do we? I mean, what is the prospect of this new kind of dialogue you're putting forward, which evades both the simple box ticking as well as the simple fascination that you can have with things outside of the Western sort of framework?
Right. So on the question of like how I'm using the notion of enlightenment, I guess it has a couple of different roles. in the book, at first it's just a sort of like using in purely in terms of the historical period and giving us a context for the conversation. But like you said, I want to play with that that kind of tension between the inverted commas Eastern religion kind of notion of enlightenment and the sort of Western European intellectual enlightenment. And because what I'm wanting to put forward is something which has those two poles, so it's a very useful kind of like discursive sort of articulation point. Of course, that as I mentioned, I believe I mentioned in the book that that the notion of enlightenment isn't itself actually, as far as I'm aware, doesn't have any single like translation in any kind of Eastern religions, and any in Buddhism, Hinduism, Sikhism. It's a sort of a Max Muller's kind of like, if anything, he was already doing that. He was already drawing the link between sort of European Enlightenment and these Eastern modes of thought, but this is kind of like been forgotten. And they've now separated apart again. I'm sort of wanting to say, okay, rather than just rejecting the term enlightenment on either side, let's play with it and see kind of where it goes. Because if we're trying to do, as I say, like trying to put forward something positive, it's necessary to know where you're beginning from. And if I'm wanting to sort of speak to the left in general, because this is very much a project of trying to intervene in the way that leftists think, you need to start with what people already know, what people already assume, or what is even just underlying those things they know and assume. And underlying a lot of the left is still Enlightenment thought, even with people that are critical of the Enlightenment. And so it's kind of quite necessary, I think, to start with that grounding, and then to try and, if you will, like sublate it, rather than just cutting it away and saying, well, we're critical of the Enlightenment, therefore it's gone and we're starting afresh, because I don't think that's possible. Rather, I think it's a much better idea to actually just engage with it and to acknowledge how it has influenced our thought, acknowledge the problematic elements of it, and also try to dig in and find moments that could actually still be useful that have been ignored. And so I begin by drawing from the this notion of radical enlightenment that Jonathan Israel, the historian, has been putting forward, and Fluss and Frem, socialists have been, Harrison Fluss and Landon Frem have been trying to apply to sort of Marxist thought, as a means of making clear that even though there may have been like a dominant sort of like conservative mode of enlightenment that has had most of the influence, there are still moments to be found, even historically, where we can still draw influence from certain things. Using enlightenment, first of all, in that kind of just a historical grounding sort of sense, moving it then on into the tension within the term of the spiritual and the intellectual. But then later, I do gradually sort of segue into it being a sort of a philosophical term that I am using, in the sense of enlightenment as a process, enlightenment as this kind of trying to integrate not only the intellectual and the spiritual in the sense of, in the historical sense of the Enlightenment, but into the sort of the forward movement utopian sense that we have in socialism. And so Enlightenment becomes this sort of like this term for the bringing together of the transformation of ourselves, the transformation of our society, the transformation of our institutions and all their interrelations, as a sort of a movement towards not a utopian endpoint, because I try to be quite clear that it's not about there's no finishing point. It's more about that ongoing process of transformation.
I actually want to change the order of the questions a little bit, because I think this fits so well into one of the other questions, which is to talk about the idea of acid communism, because of course you mentioned in the book that you're very much a fan of Mark Fisher's idea of a psychedelic reason which does not get doesn't get oneself out of one's head, but you get out through your head. And one of the things I particularly enjoyed about the book it seems to, very similar to this sort of Fisherian move, is to collapse the distinction between what Locke would call, the warm stream and the cold stream of Marxism. And it seemed to divide them into, or rather sublate that distinction into the same method. And it seems like it's very much an idea of enlightenment. Would you say enlightenment is mappable onto an idea of consciousness raising, in the sense of, we're elucidating from every different epistemology, regardless of where it's geographically or historically placed, or at least the revolutionary components within each, and we're simply raising or sort of unearthing or cultivating that seed within all of them?
Yeah, so I think the notion of consciousness raising is sort of like almost implied in the notion of enlightenment that I'm sort of putting forward. Although I think with consciousness raising, we want to make sure that we're also talking about the transformation of things which play back onto consciousness as well. Consciousness raising groups in terms of like bringing people together to raise consciousness of their sort of political realities. That's like an incredibly important sort of thing. But the notion of enlightenment I'm going with is also that kind of, which I'm sure like Mark would have was fully on board with this, like the notion of the complete transformation of all the systems beyond the individual. So there's this kind of feedback between our transformation, which transforms the world, and the world, which transforms us, and generations to come. But yeah, definitely, I was sort of conscious of the link between those things, and Mark Fisher was also kind of there's also kind of like an emotional connection for me as well. It's like there's quite a lot of biographical sort of reasons for various things that I brought in, and Mark Fisher was just one of the people that I was reading in the 2010s when lots of stuff was kicking off. And one thing I think that isn't spoken about very much about his work is that it is actually quite practical. His sort of the cybernetic aspect of his thought, and I think this ties into another question you're intending later on. The cybernetic aspect of his thought has this kind of practical, almost like engineering-like distinction in terms of how do we intervene into systems. And although a lot of the kind of the work that he was doing, the systems he was intervening in directly were more sort of just in his kind of intellectual circles around sort of, the blogosphere or what have you, he did start to do more sort of what you call traditional activism in later years, joining Plan C. I saw him speak at a TUC march, I think it was. It was one of the big sort of TUC, all the unions with all the student demonstrators, there was environmental protesters. It was one of these huge marches in the early 2010s. And so I think what I always sort of like grasped onto was that connection between theory and practice, but not necessarily in traditional modes of political practice. I've been a part of political groups, like quite old political groups, and they typically have a very different character to sort of maybe people that are taking this kind of like, I mean, it seems strange to say new cybernetic, because obviously cybernetics is now quite an old, we're talking sort of 50 or 60 years old, but sort of newer modes of thinking about organization don't necessarily have the same character as older revolutionary groups. And that's something that I think I always attached to in Marx's thought, was this notion of there's this kind of element of organizing, but like trying to think of new modes of organizing rather than falling back on old revolutionary modes.
I mean, absolutely. I mean, the problematic of trying to find a new sort of version or a new way of thinking about systems theory, about dynamics, about cybernetics is, something I'm constantly concerned with, especially on this channel. Some more recent episodes have more or less been about this question of, can we do a different cybernetics? And it's particularly the anxiety around cybernetics, particularly around sort of the idea of consciousness raising, is that, well, are we doing a top-down thing? Are we doing a saviorism? But of course, I mean, you respond to this in the sort of you respond to this in the book. When you talk about the idea of we need to change the model of education in order to have a proper conscious raising sense at all. You talk about, Paulo Freire, and the idea that there's too much of a banking model of education, and you can see this probably in some party models. The idea is that if you bank enough books on Marx or reading groups, then eventually the proletariat, if everyone buys enough books, the books are good. They're good for tools. If in the sense, like if you just plug enough people into the Marxist circuits, then everyone's going to go right. We've charged up the Marx number to 1917. Let's all go. And it's the very sort of horizontalist model of education, very participatory model of education. I think makes it so the account in this book so strong. I mean, one of the most interesting things that sort of the conceptual tools you give in the book actually is around the question of metaphysics, but it's not just a question of categorizing things as okay, there are these types of things, they're all categorical. Rather, it's process based, but also there's these two strands which I wonder if you could talk a bit more about, which is you say that red enlightenment, the philosophy of red enlightenment is fundamentally one of two categories, or two fundamental strategies, I guess, or orientations, which is ontological realism and epistemic relativism. And it seems in a way that there's a cybernetic dynamic happening between those two, in which the epistemic relativism stops the realism from becoming too hegemonic from any one perspective. And I wonder if you can sort of unpack that a bit more.
Sure. Yeah. I guess. There is a kind of although I think when I'm describing those aspects, I'm not necessarily using cybernetic language. I agree that there is quite a cybernetic aspect to that in terms of you're thinking of various systems like people or revolutionary organizations or what have you, from both not just an internal or transcendent kind of notion perspective, but also looking at them and looking at yourself in a sort of a second order kind of way, and being aware that modes of knowledge emerge from systems and emerge in systems, rather than trying to sort of fix a single system of knowledge that we will then enforce on the world. Rather, sort of seeing it as a case of, but also at the same time, not just saying, well, we're going to have a free for all of different modes of thought, and they're not going to be able to interact. They're not going to be able to sort of like talk to one another because we're all, sealed off from one another. It's trying to kind of like mediate those two positions, like the sort of scientific, if you will, kind of side that I'm coming from is, yes, science is not the be all and end all of things. It is not perfect. It's a mode of investigation. It is a system of knowledge, of accumulated knowledge. It's a series of practices and institutions. It's very fallible. It's very human. But at the same time, the things that it does often is able to uncover genuine regularities about the universe. We have to get around this kind of idea that science is somehow seeing reality, that it is directly finding it, and rather than understanding it as a way of experimenting the world and seeing how the world works regularly. But then the systems that we construct around that to try and understand it, those remain always very human, very relative to ourselves. And then, of course, recognizing that science doesn't even touch even a small fraction of all the things that human beings know and talk about, believe, need to survive. It is one mode, and it's sort of basically about sort of like understanding all of these things as different systems and how to have them interacting without, like I say, either there being a sort of top-down imposition of one of these positions being the only acceptable one, but also without there being just a sense that, well, there is no reality, there is no shared reality. Because if we say there is no shared reality, then it becomes very difficult to translate that into any sort of shared, culture, any sort of shared political movement, and that is ultimately disempowering. And I think, yeah, the political implications of that is what could seem like, philosophical nitpicking. It can actually be quite profound, I think.
I mean, especially thinking about it in terms of the question of organization, in terms of not simply, putting a map down upon a territory and saying, okay, it's fixed, but rather it's all about the negotiation. And I think this is why the book is so sort of good at avoiding some of the more common pitfalls here when we try to talk about a pluralism with kind of monistic substrate under it, which is, that, as you say, the questions are perennialism, as all religions touch upon a common truth, and therefore they're all kind of the same, or this sort of very vulgar sort of archetypal syncretism. But I guess in that case, let's move on to one of the main categories, I guess, or the fundamental sort of principles of your work, which is what is spirituality? Because it's typically people think about the spiritual as something, or literally sacred, cut off, transcendent, esoteric. But I think you want to try and reevaluate how we think about it.
Yeah. So one of the things that I want to do with the notion of spirituality is to use it in this quite pluralistic way, to try as best as we can to be able to incorporate very different sort of modes of experience that include both the traditionally religious, the non-traditionally religious, and the seemingly non-religious. And I think one of the reasons that I begin there is also because, like we were saying with the notion of enlightenment, we kind of have to start with what is actually there, whether it's a term that people are familiar with, or whether it's the sort of the assumed background. And with spirituality, I mean, we talk a lot. The left talks a lot about atheism and religion, and the collapse of religion, or what have you. But nobody really ever brings up the term spiritual, despite the fact that there are actually relatively few atheists. Very few people actually self-identify in census data as atheists. Far more people actually identify as non-religious or no specific religion. And what I find really useful and interesting with the term spirituality is this common notion of spiritual but not religious. It's a popular term. And I think that's a really interesting sort of, again, articulation point, because it throws up that question of, well, if those two things aren't the same, what is the difference? So with the way that I have approached spirituality is to say, rather than the spiritual itself being a metaphysical kind of plane, which is how it's often approached. Oh, well, I want to reach the spiritual, I believe in the spiritual, what have you. Instead, I think of the spiritual as a mode of engagement, of a sort of a mode of consciousness, and that can include supernatural realms, if you will, but it can also have a entirely naturalistic sort of underpinning. So yeah, with spirituality, I'm talking about the interrelation of metaphysics, ethics, and embodiment. In the sense that there's metaphysics, again, all of these I'm taking in a quite a loose and quite sort of general way. So metaphysics is not necessarily like an academic kind of approach to the world. It is very much just the notion that there is something beyond what we can immediately see in front of us, or what we are immediately experiencing, not necessarily sight, but that there is something beyond. And whether we're talking about a beyond of, again, a spirit world, a heaven, what have you, or if it's literally just what exists behind the sofa, that I literally can't see. There is always a notion in human consciousness of a beyond ourselves, a beyond our immediate experience. So that's metaphysics. Ethics, again, taking it in a very broad sort of sense, it's how should I act, or how should people act, both in the immediate sense and in terms of our long-term paths. And then embodiment is just the sort of the very fact that we are always embodied. This is often missed in understandings of religion and spirituality, and people get stuck into thinking about doctrine, belief systems, but actually what is far more important, far more significant in most cases, is people's bodily experience, both in terms of how they feel, the spiritual experience, but also what they do with their bodies in terms of the communities they're interacting with, how they are dressing, how they are acting. A lot of that sort of more habitual stuff is often much more important than the specifics of well, how could God exist? Is he infinite? Is he a he? All that kind of stuff, can play a role. But for most people, in fact, the embodied stuff, the embodied aspect is it can't be ignored. It's very significant. So how I am defining spirituality is the interaction of all those elements: the metaphysical, the ethical, and the embodied. Whilst acknowledging that those are actually all parts of everyday consciousness. And so what I'm saying, what we would normally call a spiritual experience, is when those things are particularly, strongly aligned, and the feeling is intensified, and the way they're interacting is very close. You sort of have, it's less of an either or, spiritual or non-spiritual. It's more of a kind of a gradation of intensity, and at a certain point there might be a knee where suddenly you're like, oh wow, I'm having a spiritual experience now, but it's more of like hitting a threshold of intensity rather than it just being an either or. We have spiritual life and non-spiritual life. So that's one of the ways in which I try to, on the one hand, give this sort of like pluralistic kind of definition, which can incorporate lots of things, but also give it quite a practical dimension, and give it quite a grounded in everyday reality, which I think is probably quite necessary if you want to do something that, obviously the term materialist is quite a contentious one, but in the broad sort of like leftist practical sense, wanting to do something materialist, I think we have to have a notion of spirituality that is kind of grounded in the everyday.
I couldn't agree more, to be honestly. I mean, we spoke about sort of the materialism about two maybe 3 years ago on Repeater Radio, about the problem is that people tend to think of materialism in this very sort of rudimentary, very mechanistic way of simply when matter is in these sort of abstract causal chains of units, rather every sort of new thing is basically another category. It's not that a sort of vulgar materialist view would take that religious experience wouldn't be sort of experience in the mode of religiosity. It would simply be a new category of experience, and how do we interrogate the validity of this category? And as you said, it all ends up in these hyper-intellectualized discussions around doctrine, and it's a very sort of Protestant sort of Lutheran view of experience. The idea of it's through faith alone, through Scripture alone, and therefore it's all a matter of an interpretation of the key text, and you lose the embodiment in favor of a sort of very abstract intellectual capacity. Whereas to think about it, as you're saying, in the idea of the intensity of experience, thinking about the ideas of ineffability or ecstasy, and the idea that actually experience becomes far too intense. I think this is how some people describe the experience of, for example, silence in the church. It's not like it's a new category of silence, but rather the architecture and the solemnity of the space allows sound, or even the lack of sound, to be experienced in more intense ways than ever before. So I think this embodiment, if anything, is kind of in a way more materialist in the sort of the sense in which Marx was critiquing people like Feuerbach for doing it, because Feuerbach's thing is purely contemplative. It does not understand its object, which is man, as a sensuous activity, a subject. If anything, we're still having this debate. About 217 years later, it's 212 years later. We better be good on that. But it is truly something we've never really escaped, this sort of 1840s post-Hegelian, post-Enlightenment German tearing each other's heads off about this abstract version of matter. And so, one of the things I really appreciate about this, I mean, if we can actually talk a little bit about sort of how sort of the left historically maybe has actually sort of tried to implement. But how do you think the left historically has tried to sort of implement these ideas about spirituality? What do you think history of sort of leftist revolutionary projects around religion has been? I mean, because you talk really interestingly actually about the Lunachevsky and Bogdanov, this idea of Soviet God building, and I think what do you think we could learn about their successes and failures, or maybe the ways in which they were held back by particular political struggles in the Soviet Union? Because this is actually a really fascinating sort of at sort of adjacent point to our discussion of materialism, because this was a debate in the Soviet Union that produced Lenin's Imperio-Material Criticism. It really does solidify the philosophy, which was going to be the commanding philosophy of tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of people for a solid 70 years. So I wonder if you could sort of unpack that a little bit.
Yeah, so it is a very sort of historically interesting and strange kind of period. One thing to point out initially is, and a lot of this is the work of Roland Boer, who you should, anyone who's interested in these kind of like this period of history and these questions, he's done the most sort of work around it. As far as I'm aware, like Lenin at first was extremely opposed to Lunacharsky and to God building and all this sort of stuff, and then he wrote, the text you mentioned where he basically savages them all. But then he had a few years later, he had this sort of like turn to Hegel when he locked himself away in libraries and just studied Hegel for ages. And as far as I'm aware, after that, he was actually more is friendlier to this idea, and Lunacharsky actually ended up being the commissar of Enlightenment after the revolution, which I think is a beautiful sort of like I couldn't resist like the connection to the title in that. But yeah, I think there seems to be like two kind of angles to God building as I understand it. The one was this kind of approach to religion from the perspective of atheists and agnostics, as I believe most of the Bolshevik God builders were, but a different way of approaching religion and religious people, rather than simply 100% cutting off and nothing but critique, actually trying to find affinities, trying to find moments of connection, and trying to find where those could be interacted with and used for the collective project of communism and human emancipation. And it's that sort of Lunacharsky was very much about sort of like reading the Bible and trying to find moments of class struggle in them and things like that. Rather than simply saying either, we either have this kind of complete rejection of religion as conservative, or this kind of like fluffy kind of liberal kind of, actually Christianity is just good. It's like, well, not necessarily either. It can be interpreted in different ways, and really what we should be doing is actually trying to argue for a certain interpretation or supporting people who are making certain arguments. And this is very much how I kind of I've been arguing for approaching, for example, contemporary questions around Christianity in America. I fully understand, given the rise of Christian nationalism, why a lot of leftists would be like, absolutely fuck Christianity. I completely understand, but I think that's actually strategically, it's not a very good way to go. Not only is it, I think, a poor analysis of religion, but I think the best way of combating Christian nationalism is realizing there's lots of Christian leftists and Christian liberals even that are fighting against Christian nationalism, and cutting ourselves off from them is actually going to make the fight against Christian nationalism harder. And it should be a case of like trying to find the moments and the people and the organization where you can actually work together on certain things. So that's the first kind of aspect of God building, as I understand it, is this more sort of like its approach to religion that's looking for affinities. And then the other aspect is perhaps the slightly more controversial aspect, is this notion of trying to build people up as though they were gods, not to worship them as gods, not to replace the worship of gods with the worship of humans, but to sort of see in the notion of, powerful beings something that human beings can strive for. Now, I think the way that I try to approach that is a little bit perhaps less controversial. There's something I'm dipping my toes into stuff I don't know very well, but I know you've been talking on Atlas Horizon about like Nietzscheanism quite a lot recently, and I get the sense that there is actually quite a strong undercurrent of Nietzsche in a lot of this period of Russian thought, and in that whole notion of God building, and also sort of like I don't mention them in the text. They're in the bibliography, but I think it's Vygotsky, the Soviet psychologist, was very much about the socialist remaking of man. I think was one of the texts of his. This sort of notion that we should be actually trying to reshape people, and obviously that can take on this kind of like very problematic or scary, even like top-down kind of notion of controlling people. But the way I want to engage with it is sort of a consensual, bottom-up, partly horizontal kind of interaction that we mutually reinforce and strengthen each other. And so, enter into a path. And you did mention before about the notion of horizontal education, but something in I mentioned once or twice, I think, is this notion, I think it's Rodrigo Nunes, I do apologize, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name, this notion of neither horizontal nor vertical, trying to find the position between them where we make use of there's horizontal modes of organizing, but still allow ourselves to create institutions and create long-term sort of power as well, rather than being stuck into, these kind of fragmented kind of ways of organizing. So those two aspects in that interpretation are very much kind of influencing how I'm thinking of Enlightenment. But I think there are problems with simply just doing God building. There's the Christian centrism of it, and so on, and whatever criticisms you want to make of the Bolshevik Party, etc., etc. But certainly this notion that revolution can't simply be about finding people that already agree with us, and we're already perfect. So all we have to find is the other perfect people, have the perfect politics, and then we enough of us get together, and then there's a revolution, and then it's happily ever after. No, I think we have to be very clear that it's about there's a collective education, even of ourselves, that are arguing for that education. We all have gaps in our knowledge and problems in how we interact with the world. And it's very much about sort of finding ways to grow collectively and become more powerful.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Considering the problems with the idea of the new Soviet man, Trotsky was kind of critical at Nietzsche at this point. He said it was kind of a petty bourgeois affectation, but at the same time, this idea it's more kind of this omnipresence in this sort of very much this sort of utilitarian technocratic project, especially when it's at least purely top down, which is the eugenic kind of impulse, and it reappears in some horizontal discourse as well from the anarchists and the like. But absolutely, in terms of the idea of sort of not the idea that we are perfect, we are the elect because we have the scripture handed down from us from Marx and Engels, and it can get a little bit suffocating. And I mean, one of the ways I think it's interesting here when we talk about the commonality of experience, it almost seems, would you say in a sense you're trying to link these elements which typically materialism sees as completely heterogeneous insofar as you posit them as singular kind of mode. And in that sense, does matter kind of collapse into, or not collapse, but does it transform into what it means for our experience and the production of experience in that sense? Because in a way, sort of the commonality you're trying to bring up here is to insert a monism which doesn't override pluralism, but is the very condition under which these pluralistic elements can be here. It's not in the sense in which the Marxist must become less Marxist, the Christian must become less Christian, and so on and so forth, but rather it's trying to articulate the thing that again, arguably Marx was talking about in the first book, which is what are your common what are your common material interests beyond. Let's be honest, what books you end up reading at the end of the day on your day off.
Yeah, so I think I always struggle when we get to the term the concept of like monism, because I think there's always implied in monism that we're talking about some sort of like underlying substance, and what I considered going into this whole substance process kind of like debate, but it's something I ended up leaving out. But basically, what I'm trying to put forward is a philosophy which rejects substance metaphysics in favor of a process metaphysics, in the sense that there is no ultimate substance that brings everything together. And I think there's a kind of an interesting sort of tension in a lot of leftist thought, in that I think ultimately Marxism has always kind of relied on a sort of process metaphysics. There's always been this, although there's the rejection of the notion of metaphysics, it's always been the rejection of a particular form of metaphysics. It's this very static kind of essentialist, unmoving, eternalist kind of metaphysics. Whereas, they want to put forward this more kind of like, notion that everything everything flows, is in process. It's about the interrelations of things. And so with the notion of, what was the question again? I've lost the track of where we were.
I just wanted to kind of unpack the idea of a process, because I was wondering to some extent if there's a metaphysical. I would basically sort of reading a monism into your work, thinking that is there some sort of monism in which these heterogeneous, or at least a common process, even if not a common substance, or even a substance which is itself dynamic, which allows us to bring these different camps together. Because because the typical view would be these two are different categories. We have materialists and idealists, never the two shall meet. Religion is idealist or dogmatic or bourgeois, etc., etc. And it seems like what we're trying to do here is provide to use a Kantian sort of turn of phrase, a schematism to bring together these two heterogeneous elements by showing that actually they have the same common ground, which is the very condition of experience themselves. And that's why spirituality isn't a different kind of experience. It's just like experience to a different power, let's say.
Yeah. As much as I might want to avoid like a monism, I guess I still have to rely on some underlying sort of like primary notion which does bring those together, bring them together into a single field. Like I fall back on reality is the term that I end up with. So rather than it being like a fixed substance that stuff is differentiated from, like in Spinoza, it's more just that, well, we're going to assume that at least something is real. We've kind of got to assume that, or maybe we don't have to assume that, but most people do assume that something is real. And so that's going to be our sort of grounding concept. And yeah, it's rather than relying, like say, on either matter or ideas, materialism, idealism, it's just saying, okay, we have something that is real, and we have to be able to incorporate all these different perspectives within that framework.
Yeah, there's a temptation here to be to go. There's this weird Guattarian formula. They say monism equals pluralism. It's all about the production of sense. But at the end, ultimately you invoke much more Whiteheadian formula, and they probably do a lot much more work, especially than plugging in a kind of a weirder French Spinozism where you have to end up, unpacking so much jargon where it ends up crystallizing into its own sort of little cul-de-sac. But there's one term, particularly towards the end of the book, which I'd really like to talk about a bit more, which is the idea of the acceleration of spirits. Because the idea of an acceleration, we're on zero repeater. There's like a specter of the idea of it, because it's not accelerate the category. It's not accelerate the mechanism or the mechanic change goes out. It's accelerate the process. And what is the acceleration you're trying to talk about here? Is it an intensification of the dynamic of the discourse between the idea of a secular left and a religious left, or the secular left and religious people generally, including the left wing members of that community? Or is it, in a way, an attempt to kind of intensify the experience that the sort of secular reading would actually disavow, or rather would not be able to see as sort of spiritual in that sense? I mean, I remember sort of one point you talk about the idea of the sublime, in Kant, and how rather we don't need necessarily sort of secularize that to pin it down out of any kind of intellectual snobbery, but intellectual kind of disgust. It's like, oh god, I'm relapsing into dogmatism or something.
Yeah, so the notion of spirit that I'm using in the book is, it is a kind of almost pseudo Hegelian spirit. I'll probably be criticised by Hegelians for just like mangling it, but I'm not claiming it is actually Hegel's notion of spirit. I'm just sort of bouncing off it. But I'm sort of taking the notion of spirit as a way of talking about what we might, if we were looking simply at biological systems, what we might think of as life. Particularly the life-mind connection, not seeing life and mind as separate things, but of life as intimately cognitive. But of course, in the book, I'm not just talking about biological systems. I want to talk about all kinds of systems. And so it goes even beyond that. It's basically just talking about autopoiesis, about self-reproducing systems. So any system which, self-reproduces, has its own sort of sensing apparatus for navigating the world, and which co-evolves with other bodies. So just having that as a notion that it's not biological life, but it's a form of life which it crosses over human beings, animals, plants, organizations, cities, the global ecosystem, all of these kind of systems in that very sort of schematic kind of way. And what the intensification I'm talking about, the acceleration, is this path towards the creation of what by the end I'm calling things like mutual freedom, but which is earlier on I'm talking in terms of the relative autonomy of systems. So systems that are able to interact in a way which increases the freedom and power of both of them, rather than one dominating the other or the two destroying one another. So the creation of both ways of interacting the world as individuals, but also the creation of social systems which empower its individuals. That is part of the path, that mutual freedom. There are various other things I end up bringing into that as well, but it's this notion of basically intensifying those interrelations and entering into a collective path. But this also includes a mode of secularity that isn't the enforcing of a bland sort of naturalism on everyone, but like you say, creating this sort of like framework that can integrate both the kind of atheist and religious viewpoints. The secular in that ideal sense, which rarely actually happens, of a genuine pluralism which aids everyone, rather than a pluralism which is actually effectively atheist. So yeah, it does include that kind of notion of a necessary outside and a lack of ever fully knowing what is that outside, and an acceptance of, at the one at the same time, an acceptance of the limitations of our knowledge, but also a constant drive to expand that knowledge. That's kind of like part of integrated into this notion of the acceleration of spirit. It's sort of the culmination of everything that the rest of the book is talking about, in terms of like I say, empowering both the individual and the collective.
I mean, there might be a few Hegelians going, hold up, none of this is in the Bible.
Yeah.
Okay, never mind. The old background's not too good for that joke, but it honestly, it does actually work very well in terms of, you describe this acceleration of the interrelation of processes, or the way their intensification, because insofar as it is an intensification of experience, we will come closer to them and therefore to the therefore to understanding their own systems in even greater degree, into an even greater degree. It becomes this kind of, I love it, 'cause it becomes a kind of global standpoints in a way, which is trying to cultivate all of these particular sort of energies. And it's probably sort of the first good good definition of any sort of accelerated process, where you've sort of looked at it and gone, oh, that's actually a good one. It's not making things better till worse
Yeah.
until they get better. It's not rolling the dice and hoping that the technology companies are accidentally going to, and do Blade Runner, we can go live with Roy Batty. It is a genuine, it's just a beautiful sentence when you say, it's a response to this impulse we have philosophically and epistemically for a kind of perfectionism. And in a way, it kind of actually avoids the trap of Hegelianism, which Hegel will never say they will never say the system is perfect, but they'll say that they've got the best tools to make it perfect. So, you just have to get on board with the process slash program here. You need to kind of build on Hegel and the like. But again, far too over intellectualizing. You said just to quote, the overall trajectory of a global social movement requires an acceleration of the processes which produce and reproduce liberatory systems on all scales, ecological, social, and psychological. And it really is this sort of fulfillment of, in a way, sort of what a lot of people are looking for from, it's people looking for from leftist engagement in a way. There's a risk here that sometimes we approach these sort of questions or theories too much like in the sort of Western sense, Enlightenment philosophers, where we're sort of reading it for a kind of intellectual verisimilitude attached to texts, rather than what we actually want. We want global emancipation. We don't necessarily want to know whether this scholarly interpretation in this journal about the role of synthesis and dialectic is just that right. So it is genuinely a beautiful breath of fresh air to read stuff like this.
Oh, excellent. That notion of like what people actually would want from a popular leftism. I think it's something I talk about in the book is the notion of freedom, and how the left has basically just given the notion of freedom to the right, and interprets freedom as a sort of an individual freedom, and therefore one that we can't really engage with. But really, I think what most people want from their life, one of the things, maybe not the only thing, but people enjoy the feeling of freedom. Like human beings tend to really enjoy feeling free. Like when you go to I've had some friends at a festival this weekend, having a great time because they're in a limited space and there are limited things you can do, see bands, drink, but within that, that field, literal field, there's a feeling of freedom. You've cast off the problems of the week, of the work, of education, and you are free within those bounds. People love this feeling. That's why they go to football matches. It's why they watch films, so they can, like, the notion of switching off. The left tends to approach these kind of things as purely like negative. People, it's because our society is so bad that people will want to, escape from their realities. It's like, I think human beings kind of like escaping in general. I think it's fun, and some amount of what we call escapism is actually a good thing. I think finding a way of engaging with the notion of freedom and integrating it into a sort of a socialist program, if you will. I don't like that word program, but into a socialist movement is a really important thing. But obviously we have to take into account those criticisms of freedom as an individualist concept and develop a notion of collective freedom and a freedom with. But I really think we need to lean into that rather than back off it, because people like freedom, and that's something that we should try and, like I say, lean into.
Absolutely. Well, I think we're just coming up to the hour. So finally, I had to mention a few other things, actually, because I forgot to mention them at the outset. I did mention Shock Doctrine of the Left, but also, Greg, you also do a Theory ASMR project. Is that still ongoing? Where can people find you?
It's on pause at the moment, but I do intend to do a few more. Basically, I sort of my concentration span goes all over the place sometimes, and I'll usually I'll have a really intense period where I'll just focus on one project, and then I'll just go and do something completely different. So currently it's on pause, but there'll be there'll be more in future. Yeah, it's ASMR Theory on YouTube, and there are sort of like readings of Mark Fisher and stuff with a quiet whispered voice, if that's your sort of thing, to try and get to sleep. But yeah, I'm working on all kinds of things at the moment. We'll see. I'm trying to put together a small, almost like practical companion to Red Enlightenment, a radical mindfulness book, because I did run actual mindfulness groups, but in the past, and sort of I need to write up everything that we learned from that kind of experiment, just so somebody else can pick it up and experiment with it themselves and see where it goes. So.
That's the answer to that question. Red Enlightenment is acid communism. Yes, we are completing the system. This is I'm loving the idea of radical mindfulness. This is very much okay. We'll probably see you end up like the world transformed or something, being this great yogic figure leading us all to try and de-stress ourselves from the horrors mostly of living in Britain at a time like this. But
yeah.
Graham Jones, Red Enlightenment out now, folks. Repeater books. We'll put in some links in the show notes. We'll also put a link to we'll find a playlist for Graham's sort of old Red Enlightenment episodes. We can sort of revisit the thought process, see the sort of blooming sort of the process. It's a process. It's not a category. It's a process. You've got to trust the process. But folks, thank you for listening, and Graham, thank you for coming on.
Thanks very much for having me.
We appreciate your support of the imprint and the channel. Subscribe to Zero Books Today on Patreon. Your material support helps us to promote a variety of perspectives on the left. Also, discover the many titles, new and old, that Zero has curated. Navigate to any of the links in the show notes to extend your support.